What would you do if something in the Louisiana bayou had been watching your family for generations? Or if the wind through Appalachian pines started singing your deepest secrets? Or if you heard a train that hadn't run in 70 years still carrying passengers who never made it home? The American South holds darkness that runs deeper than its roots. From black swamp waters to forgotten delta crossroads, from kudzu strangled mansions to isolated wiregrass plains where old curses meet new victims. Tonight, Verified Fears brings you 11 encounters from the heart of the South, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds, where folk legends walk among the living, and where some things never die. They just wait in the heat for their next victim. Welcome to the South, horror family. Let's begin. What would you do if something in the water started watching you back, and you realized it had been watching your family for generations? My name is Marcel Thibodeau, and I'm a third-generation fishing guide in the deepest parts of the Louisiana bayou. My grandfather taught my father these waterways. My father taught me, and I thought I knew every channel, every cypress stand, every sandbar in this godforsaken swamp. I was wrong. There are things in the bayou older than the trees, older than the water itself, and my family has been keeping a terrible secret to keep them satisfied. It started 3 weeks ago when I took a group of tourists from Dallas deep into the backwater channels where the good fishing is. The kind of place you can only reach by pirogue, where the cypress trees grow so thick the sunlight barely touches the water, and the Spanish moss hangs down like rotting curtains. The air back there is different. It's thick, heavy, like trying to breathe through wet cotton. The smell of decay and wet earth is so strong you can taste it. My clients were the usual type, city people looking for an authentic experience, taking pictures of everything, complaining about the heat and the mosquitoes. I'd given this tour 100 times before. I knew exactly where to take them, exactly what to say, exactly how to make them feel like they'd seen the real bayou without actually showing them anything dangerous. We were about 2 hours in when I noticed the marks on the trees, symbols carved deep into the bark of the cypress trunks, old enough that the wood had grown around them, but fresh enough that I could still see the cuts clearly. I'd never seen them before, and I'd been down this channel my entire life. They weren't random either. They formed a pattern, repeating every 50 yards or so, always on the water side of the tree where you'd see them from a boat. My grandfather had taught me some of the old Cajun symbols, the ones the trappers used to mark their territory or warn about dangerous water. But these were different. These were older, cruder, more deliberate. They looked like warnings. I didn't mention them to my clients. No point in spooking tourists over some old carvings. But I felt uneasy in a way I'd never felt in these waters before. The bayou was too quiet. Usually you hear gators bellowing, birds calling, fish jumping, the constant buzz and hum of a million insects. But right then, there was nothing. Just the sound of our paddles cutting through the black water and my own breathing getting faster despite myself. One of my clients, a guy named Brad, who'd been talking non-stop since we launched, finally shut up. Even he felt it. That's when Sarah disappeared. 1 second she was in the boat behind mine, taking pictures of an egret, and the next second she was just gone. No splash, no scream, nothing. Her husband started shouting her name, standing up in the pirogue and nearly capsizing it. I told everyone to stay calm, stay in their boats, but inside I was panicking. People don't just vanish in the middle of a bayou tour. I radioed for help, but we were too deep in for a good signal. All I got was static and fragments of voices that didn't sound quite right, didn't sound quite human. We searched for 3 hours. The other guides came out, the sheriff's department sent their swamp boat. We had half the parish out there looking. Nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no torn clothing caught on branches. Sarah had simply ceased to exist. But I noticed something the others didn't. The symbols on the trees had changed. New marks had appeared, carved fresh into the wood, still weeping sap. And they formed a path, leading deeper into the swamp, toward the places even I didn't go. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those symbols, about my grandfather's stories, about the things he'd told me when I was young that I dismissed as superstition. He used to talk about the old ways, about offerings that had to be made, about respect that had to be shown to the things that lived in the deep water. My father had laughed it off, called it folklore, said the old man was losing his mind. But now I wasn't so sure. I went through my grandfather's belongings, the stuff my father had boxed up after he died, and I found his journal. Page after page of symbols, prayers, instructions, and a confession. Our family had been making offerings to something in the bayou for over 150 years. My great-great-grandfather had encountered it when he first came to Louisiana, something ancient that the Chitimacha people had known about long before any Europeans arrived. They called it the Bayou Watcher, a spirit or entity that claimed the swamp as its territory. It would allow people to fish, to trap, to make their living from the water, but only if they paid tribute. One life every 7 years, given willingly or taken by force. My great-great-grandfather had made the deal to protect his family, and every generation since had honored it, except my father. He'd refused, called it superstition and nonsense, and he died in the bayou 2 years ago, drowned in 3 feet of water under circumstances that never made sense. I realized with growing horror that I was 7 years past due. Sarah wasn't the first person to disappear on my tours in the last few months. There had been others, incidents I'd explained away as accidents, people wandering off and getting lost, drownings in strong currents. But now I understood. The Bayou Watcher was collecting what it was owed, and it would keep taking until someone in my family acknowledged the debt. I went back into the bayou alone the next morning, following the symbols deeper than I'd ever gone. The water turned from brown to pure black, and the trees grew so close together I had to abandon my boat and wade through water up to my chest. The smell of rot was overwhelming, and things brushed against my legs beneath the surface that I tried not to think about. I found them in a clearing I swear had never existed before. Sarah and the others, standing in a circle in waist-deep water, their eyes completely white, their mouths moving but making no sound. And in the center of the circle, something massive broke the surface. I can't describe what I saw, because my mind won't let me remember it clearly. Just an impression of something old and patient and hungry, something that had been waiting decades for my family to remember our obligation. It spoke to me, without words, directly into my head. It showed me visions of my ancestors making their offerings, of the prosperity it had brought my family, of the protection it had provided. And it showed me what would happen if I refused. Not just my death, but everyone I guided into the bayou, everyone who fished these waters, everyone in my family for generations to come. The debt would be paid in blood, one way or another. I understood then why my grandfather had done it, why generations of Thibodeau men had made this terrible choice. Not because they were evil, but because they were trying to protect everyone else. I made the offering. I won't tell you what it was or how I did it, but the Bayou Watcher accepted it. Sarah and the others were found 2 days later, alive but with no memory of what had happened. The authorities called it a miracle. I call it a transaction. The symbols on the trees have changed again, marking the boundaries of the watcher's territory, reminding me of the agreement. And I've started keeping my own journal, just like my grandfather did. Because 7 years from now, someone in my family is going to have to make the same choice I did. I still guide tours in the bayou. I still take tourists out to see the cypress trees and the Spanish moss and the alligators. But I never go past the symbols. I never venture into the deep water where the bayou watcher waits. And when people ask me about the carvings on the trees, I tell them they're old trapper marks, nothing to worry about. Because some secrets are too terrible to share, and some debts can never be forgiven, only paid. The bayou takes care of those who respect it, my grandfather used to say. Now I understand what he meant. It's not respect, it's fear, and it's the only thing keeping me alive. The wind doesn't just blow through the mountains, it speaks. I know how that sounds, believe me. 6 months ago, I would have laughed at someone telling me this story. But now I'm the one telling it, and I need you to understand that what happened to me in those Tennessee mountains wasn't madness, wasn't isolation, wasn't cabin fever. The mountain was alive, and it knew things about me that no one else knew. Things I'd buried so deep, I'd forgotten them myself. My name is Raven, and I'm a writer. Or at least, I was trying to be. I'd spent 3 years in Chicago churning out corporate blog posts and social media content, watching my actual writing dreams die a little more each day. When my grandmother passed away and left me some money, I decided to do what every frustrated writer does: rent an isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere, and finally work on my novel. I found a place in the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee, so far off the grid that the property manager had to mail me hand-drawn directions. No internet, no cell service, just me and my laptop and 3 months of winter solitude. It seemed perfect. It seemed exactly what I needed. The cabin was older than I expected, built sometime in the 1960s from local timber that had weathered to a dark gray. It sat on the side of a mountain, surrounded by towering white pines that grew so thick they blocked out most of the sky. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles down a dirt road that became impassable when it snowed. The property manager, an old man named Virgil, who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the cabin, gave me the keys and a long look that made me uncomfortable. He asked if I'd ever spent a winter in the mountains before. I told him no, but I was prepared. He shook his head slowly and said, "Prepared ain't got nothing to do with it. If you hear the singing, don't listen to the words. And if it knows your name, you leave. You leave right then and don't look back." I smiled politely and assumed he was trying to spook the city girl. I wish to God he had been. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I wrote every day, actual good writing that felt like it meant something. The silence was profound, the kind of quiet that you never experience in a city. At night, I'd sit by the wood stove and listen to the wind moving through the pines outside, a constant rushing sound like distant water. It was soothing at first, almost musical. The pines were so tall and so densely packed that even in winter with no leaves on the other trees, they created a perpetual twilight around the cabin. Snow began falling in the second week, heavy and consistent, and within days the road out was completely blocked. I wasn't worried. I had supplies for months and a satellite phone for emergencies. I was finally completely alone with my work. That's when I started to hear the patterns in the wind. It wasn't just random sound anymore. There were rhythms, repetitions, something almost like melody. I told myself I was being imaginative, that my writer's brain was finding patterns where none existed. But the sounds became clearer each night. By the third week, I could swear I heard harmonics, multiple tones weaving together like a choir warming up. And then, one night during a particularly fierce windstorm, I heard words. Not clear, not distinct, but unmistakably language. The wind was singing, and it was singing in English. I tried to ignore it. I turned on my battery-powered radio, played music through my headphones, buried myself in my writing. But the singing persisted, growing stronger, more insistent. It was coming from the pines specifically, I realized. When the wind hit those trees at certain angles, they produced tones that combined into something that shouldn't be possible. I researched it obsessively in the books I'd brought. I learned about Aeolian tones, about how wind moving through objects can create sound, about acoustic phenomena in forests. But none of that explained why the sounds formed words, or why those words seemed directed at me. The singing started, including my name. Raven. The wind would whisper through the pines, drawing it out into multiple syllables. Raven, Raven. And then it began telling me things. Secrets from my childhood, embarrassing moments I'd tried to forget, cruel thoughts I'd had about people I loved, private things, intimate things, things I'd never told another soul. The wind knew that I'd stolen money from my grandmother when I was 16. It knew about the classmate I'd bullied in 7th grade until she changed schools. It knew about the manuscript I'd plagiarized in college, the relationship I'd sabotaged out of jealousy, the friend who'd called me in crisis that I'd ignored because I was too busy. Every mistake, every petty cruelty, every moment of cowardice I'd spent my adult life trying to bury. The mountain sang them all back to me in perfect, horrible detail. I found the journals on the 4th week. They were hidden in a closet I'd been using for storage, tucked behind some old blankets. 5 notebooks, different handwriting in each, all describing the same experience I was having. The singing that started as melody and became words. The mountain that knew impossible things. The previous renters had all documented their time here, and I realized with growing horror that none of them had finished their stays. The last entry in each journal was always frantic, always describing how the singing had moved from revealing past secrets to predicting future ones, to describing events that hadn't happened yet but would, to showing them ways that they would hurt people, ways they would fail, ways they would die. The most recent journal was dated just 6 months ago, written by a man named Thomas who'd come here to finish his dissertation. His final entry was barely legible. It's not just remembering anymore. It's showing me things. It showed me my daughter's accident. It showed me the exact moment. I have to leave. I have to warn her. But the road is gone and the singing says I won't make it down the mountain, and it's never been wrong about anything else. There were no more entries. I looked him up on my satellite phone's limited internet. Thomas Brennan had died in a fall on the mountain 6 months ago. His daughter had died in a car accident 3 weeks later, exactly as the singing had apparently predicted. I should have left immediately. I should have hiked out regardless of the snow, the cold, the blocked road. But part of me didn't want to leave. Part of me needed to know what the mountain would tell me next. Because as terrifying as the revelations were, they were also true. The mountain wasn't lying, wasn't exaggerating. It was holding up a mirror to my entire life, showing me exactly who I was behind all the stories I told myself. And the worst part was that I was starting to hear the predictions. Quiet whispers between the revelations about the past, glimpses of possible futures. The singing told me I would betray someone I loved within the year. It told me I would make a choice that would ruin a stranger's life. It told me I would become the person I'd always been terrified of becoming. I tried to fight it. I went outside and screamed at the trees, demanding silence. The wind only laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I tried to cut down one of the pines with the cabin's axe, but after 3 hours of chopping, I'd barely made a dent. And the singing grew louder, angrier, more personal. It started describing my mother's death, which hadn't happened yet, but would, in details so specific, I vomited in the snow. It described the exact words I would say to my sister that would make her never speak to me again. It described the novel I was working on, revealing plot points I hadn't written yet, showing me how it would be rejected by every publisher, how I would give up writing entirely, how I would die in obscurity, having accomplished nothing. On the 32nd night, I understood. The mountain wasn't haunted. The mountain was conscious. The pines were its voice, and the wind was its breath. And it had been here long before humans arrived, and would be here long after we were gone. It didn't hate us. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. We were just interesting to it, the way we might find an ant colony interesting. It liked to see what we would do when confronted with absolute truth about ourselves. It liked to watch us break. I packed everything I could carry before dawn and started hiking out. The singing followed me, the trees somehow projecting their voices for miles. It told me I wouldn't make it. It told me exactly where I would fall, exactly how long it would take me to freeze to death, exactly what my last thoughts would be. But it also told me something else, something it might not have meant to reveal. It told me that I had a choice. Every prediction it made was conditional on me staying the person I was. The future wasn't fixed. The cruelties it predicted I would commit were only inevitable if I chose to commit them. I made it down the mountain. It took me 4 days of hiking through deep snow, sleeping in caves, rationing the supplies I could carry. The singing grew fainter each mile, but I can still hear it sometimes when the wind picks up, still trying to tell me who I'll become. I moved back to Chicago. I kept writing, but different things now, honest things. I call my sister every week. I donated my grandmother's money to anti-bullying programs. I'm not trying to be a good person because of morality or religion or fear. I'm trying to be good because the mountain showed me the alternative, and I refuse to prove it right. The pines are still singing somewhere in those Tennessee mountains. And I hope to God no one else rents that cabin, because the mountain is patient, and it's always hungry for new secrets to sing. They tell you that history is in the past, safely locked away in textbooks and museums where it can't hurt anyone anymore. They're lying. I'm a historian, 45 years old, and I spent 2 decades researching civil rights history in rural Alabama, documenting stories that people wanted to forget. I thought I understood the weight of the past, the way it shapes the present. I was wrong. The past isn't behind us at all. It's running on a schedule, and sometimes it comes back to collect what it's owed. My name is Ryder, and last summer I was researching disappearances along the old Mobile and Birmingham railway line, a route that was decommissioned in 1968. There were reports, mostly from black families in the area, of people who'd bought tickets and boarded trains in the 1950s and simply never arrived at their destinations. No bodies, no investigations, no records. Just families waiting at stations for loved ones who never came home. The official explanation was that people had gotten off at earlier stops, changed their plans, run away to the north. But I'd found too many cases, Too many grieving families with the same story, too many unanswered questions. I knew something had happened on that railway line, something deliberate and terrible that had been covered up. The old depot in Wilcox County was still standing, barely. Kudzu had overtaken most of the structure, winding through broken windows and pulling at the rotting wood. The tracks were long gone, torn up and sold for scrap decades ago. But the platform remained, cracked concrete slowly being reclaimed by Alabama clay. I'd gotten permission from the county to examine the site, looking for any records that might have been left behind. It was August, the height of summer, and the heat was suffocating. The air was so thick with humidity you could see it, and the sound of cicadas was deafening. A constant scream that made it hard to think. I was alone, which is how I preferred to work. With just my recording equipment and my notebooks and the weight of all those lost lives pressing down on me. I found the room behind a false wall in what used to be the station master's office. Someone had sealed it up, plastered over it, painted it to match the rest of the wall. But time and water damage had revealed the seams, and when I pushed, the old plaster crumbled away. Inside was a small space, maybe 6 by 8 feet, and it was full of luggage. Dozens of suitcases, old-fashioned ones made of cardboard and leather, the kind people carried in the 1950s. Each one had a name tag attached, handwritten in careful script. I opened the first one with shaking hands and found clothes, toiletries, a Bible, a letter addressed to someone in Detroit that was never sent. These were the belongings of the disappeared, stored away like evidence of a crime that no one had ever been charged with. I spent hours documenting everything, photographing each suitcase and its contents, recording the names on my audio equipment. There were 43 suitcases in total, 43 people who had vanished from that depot between 1952 and 1957. As the sun began to set, and the light coming through the broken windows turned orange and then red, I heard it for the first time. A distant whistle, the unmistakable sound of a steam locomotive. I went outside thinking maybe there was a heritage railway nearby that I didn't know about, some tourist attraction running evening excursions. But there was nothing. Just the empty platform, the overgrown track's bed, and that sound getting closer. The train appeared out of nowhere, materializing on tracks that didn't exist anymore. It was a perfectly preserved 1950s passenger train, painted in the green and gold livery of the Mobile and Birmingham Railway, steam pouring from its engine. It pulled into the station with a screech of brakes, and the doors opened. People began to step off. Black men and women dressed in the clothing of 70 years ago, carrying the same suitcases I'd just been cataloging inside the depot. They looked confused, disoriented, checking pocket watches and asking each other what had happened, why the station looked so different. They couldn't see me. I was standing right there on the platform. But they looked through me like I was the ghost. I watched as a white man in a conductor's uniform stepped off the train, followed by 3 other white men in clothes that marked them as local, as people of authority in 1950s Alabama. The conductor was holding a clipboard, calling out names. As each passenger acknowledged their name, the men grabbed them, forced them back onto the train despite their protests and screams. I understood then what I was witnessing. These people hadn't simply disappeared. They'd been taken, rounded up under some pretense, loaded back onto a train that would take them somewhere they'd never return from. This was a lynching, mass murder disguised as railroad operations. And I was watching it happen in real time 70 years after the fact. I tried to intervene, screaming at them to stop, running toward the passengers to warn them. But my hands passed through their bodies like smoke. I was watching a recording, a moment in time playing out on an endless loop. The train filled up with screaming, crying passengers who understood now that they were being taken to their deaths. The conductor blew his whistle, and the train began to pull away from the station. As it picked up speed, I saw faces pressed against the windows, hands beating on the glass, mouths open in silent screams that the cicadas drowned out. The train disappeared into the gathering darkness, and suddenly I was alone again on an empty platform, standing on concrete cracked by 70 years of weather, with no tracks and no train, and only the cicadas for company. I should have left then. I should have gone back to my car, driven to the nearest town, contacted the authorities. But I was a historian. This was evidence of a massacre that had been erased from history, and I needed to understand what had happened. I went back inside the depot and found the station master's logbooks, decades old and water-damaged, but still partially legible. The entries for those years were coded, but once I understood the system, it was horrifyingly clear. The station master had been working with local law enforcement and the railway company to identify black passengers traveling north. They were pulled off the trains, their tickets confiscated, their belongings seized. The official record showed they'd never boarded. The unofficial record, written in careful pencil notations, showed they'd been taken to a place called Mercy Woods, about 15 miles from the depot. I found Mercy Woods on a county map from 1955. It didn't exist on modern maps, had been swallowed up by a reservoir built in the 1970s, but I could triangulate the location. I drove there the next day, parked at the edge of the water, and hired a boat from a local fisherman who gave me strange looks when I told him where I wanted to go. The water was murky, stained dark by tannic acid from decaying vegetation. And when we reached the coordinates, my depth finder showed something on the bottom. A structure, metal, roughly the size and shape of a railway car. That night, I heard the train again. This time I was in my hotel room 20 miles away, but I heard it clearly. The whistle cutting through the darkness, the rumble of wheels on phantom tracks. I looked out my window and saw it passing in the distance. A ghostly light moving through the Alabama night, heading back toward the depot. I drove there, arriving just as the train pulled in. The same scene played out, the same passengers stepping off, the same conductor calling names, the same forced boarding. But this time, one of the passengers saw me. A young woman, couldn't have been more than 20, locked eyes with me as they dragged her toward the train. She mouthed 2 words: "Help us." I realized then that this wasn't just a recording. This was a loop, a moment in time that was repeating, and the people trapped in it knew they were trapped. They'd been living this night over and over for 70 years, stepping off the train with hope, being forced back on with terror, dying again and again in those woods that were now underwater. The woman who'd seen me broke away from the conductor and ran toward me, reaching out her hand. When our fingers touched, the world lurched sideways, and suddenly I wasn't on the platform anymore. I was on the train, surrounded by terrified passengers, and the year was 1955. The train was heading to the woods. I could see it through the windows, the dark trees growing closer. The passengers were praying, crying, holding each other. Some were trying to break the windows, but the glass wouldn't shatter. The conductor walked through the car, that same clipboard in his hand, checking off names like he was taking attendance. When he got to me, he stopped, confused. "You're not on the list," he said, and his face twisted into something inhuman, something ancient and hungry. "But the train takes everyone who knows. The train always collects." I don't remember how I got off. One moment I was trapped in 1955, heading towards certain death, and the next I was lying on the platform in 2025, gasping for air, my clothes soaked with sweat that smelled like coal smoke and terror. The train was gone. The sun was rising. I ran to my car and drove straight through to Atlanta, didn't stop until I was 300 miles away. But distance doesn't matter. Every night at midnight, I hear that whistle. Every night, I see that train in my dreams. And every night, more passengers see me watching. They're reaching out now, all of them, trying to pull me back, trying to make me share their loop of death and resurrection. The past isn't past. It's a train that runs on schedule. And I bought a ticket the moment I opened that sealed room. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know what happened in Wilcox County to those 43 people whose names are carved on my memory like scars. I'm writing this because the train is getting closer and I think my ticket is about to be punched. If you're reading this, if you find my research, don't go to that depot. Don't look for that train. Some history shouldn't be uncovered because the past doesn't want to be known. It wants company. And the midnight train is always looking for passengers who remember. I never believed in curses until I watched a rose bush grow a human hand. Not around a hand, not over a hand, but actually produce one from its roots, like it was the most natural thing in the world. My name is Carlos. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a landscape architect. I work with soil and seeds and living things every day, so I understand how plants grow. What I saw in that South Carolina garden wasn't growth. It was resurrection, and it was revenge. The job seemed perfect when it came through. A historical society had acquired the old Belmont plantation outside Charleston, one of those antebellum estates that tourists love to visit, so they can pretend the past was romantic instead of horrific. They wanted the gardens restored to their original glory, based on plans from 1847. The pay was incredible, the timeline was generous, and it would be the kind of portfolio piece that could define my career. I took the job without hesitation, drove down from Charlotte with a truck full of equipment, and met the Historical Society director on a humid morning in late March, when the azaleas were just starting to bloom and the air smelled like pluff mud and Confederate jasmine. The gardens had been abandoned for decades, left to grow wild after the last private owner died in the 1970s. What remained was a twisted jungle of overgrown hedges, volunteer trees, and invasive species choking out whatever formal design had once existed. But underneath the chaos, I could see the bones of something magnificent. Brick pathways buried under decades of leaf litter, the crumbling remains of a fountain, the geometric patterns of what had been elaborate parterres. I spent the first week just surveying, taking measurements, clearing away enough undergrowth to understand what I was working with. That's when I found the iron fence, half buried and completely hidden by wisteria vines, marking off a section of the property that wasn't on any of the original garden plans. Inside the fence was different soil, darker, richer, almost black compared to the red clay everywhere else on the property. Nothing was growing there, which was strange because South Carolina low country will grow anything. I should have been looking at 50 years of accumulated vegetation. But instead, it was bare earth, as if something was preventing anything from taking root. I mentioned it to the Historical Society director, a woman named Faith who'd spent 30 years studying the plantation. Her face went carefully neutral, and she told me that area wasn't part of the restoration project. When I pressed her, she finally admitted it had been a burial ground for enslaved people, and they were working with descendant communities to properly memorialize the site. She asked me, very politely, not to disturb it. I agreed, of course. I'm not a monster. But the barrier between the burial ground and the garden I was restoring was less than 10 feet in some places. And as I began excavating and replanting, I kept finding things. Buttons made of bone, pieces of pottery, scraps of fabric that disintegrated when I touched them, and bones. Small ones at first, animal bones, I told myself, though I knew they weren't. I documented everything, contacted Faith, followed proper protocols. But I didn't stop working. I should have stopped working. The plans I was following had been drawn by a man named Cornelius Belmont, the plantation owner who designed the gardens as a gift for his wife. They were beautiful plans, intricate and ambitious, calling for plants from around the world, complex water features, hidden grottos, and maze-like paths. As I studied them more closely, I realized the garden had been designed with the burial ground as its focal point. Every pathway led toward it. Every sight line directed the eye to it, as if Cornelius had been obsessed with that particular piece of ground. I found his journals in the Historical Society archives, expecting horticultural notes. What I found instead was documentation of his experiments. Cornelius Belmont had been interested in botany, but not in any scientific way. He'd been trying to prove that the soil enriched by the dead could produce superior plants. He'd experimented with different fertilizers, different combinations of human and animal remains, carefully noting which plants thrived when planted over bodies. The journals were clinical, detached, horrifying. He'd recorded the names of enslaved people he'd had buried in specific locations, then documented what he'd planted above them and how well it grew. The garden wasn't just built near the burial ground. The garden was the burial ground, expanded and elaborated over decades, with bodies buried according to a precise botanical plan. I should have quit the job immediately. I should have exposed what I'd found and walked away. But I'd already torn up half the garden by then, already replanted sections according to Cornelius's plans. And the plants were growing like nothing I'd ever seen. Roses that bloomed overnight, reaching full maturity in days instead of months. Boxwoods that grew 6 inches in a week. Azaleas producing flowers so vibrant they almost hurt to look at. The Historical Society was thrilled, already planning the grand opening, already advertising the miraculous restoration. I told myself I'd finish the job and then tell them the truth. I told myself I could make this right. The plants started changing in late April. The roses developed thorns that looked less like wood and more like bone, sharp and slightly curved like claws. The wisteria vines moved when there was no wind, reaching and grasping. The boxwoods grew in patterns that weren't quite geometric, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, almost like words. I worked longer hours, trying to prune everything back to something normal. But the plants grew back overnight, always in those same disturbing patterns. Other workers started quitting, claiming they heard voices in the garden, saw things moving in their peripheral vision. I was alone by the beginning of May, just me and the plants and whatever was waking up underneath them. The hand emerged on May 7th, reaching up through the roots of a noisette rose I'd planted over what the plans indicated had been a flower bed, but what I now knew had been a grave. It was brown and desiccated at first, but as I watched in paralyzed horror, it began to fill out, gaining substance and color. The rose bush pulsed, its roots visible above ground now, wrapped around the arm like veins. Other plants started doing the same thing. Faces pressing up through the soil beneath the boxwoods, bodies tangled in the wisteria roots, dozens of people clawing their way toward the surface, using the plants as scaffolding to pull themselves back into the world. I ran for my truck, but the garden had grown across the pathways, blocking every exit. The plants weren't just alive anymore. They were directed, purposeful, working together. Vines wrapped around my ankles and pulled me down. Roots erupted from the soil and pinned my arms. The people emerging from the ground surrounded me, and I saw that they weren't quite whole. They were part plant now, or the plants were part them. Skin blending into bark, hair tangling with leaves. They looked at me with eyes that were human and something else. Something that had spent 170 years underground, feeding plants with their bodies, becoming part of the ecosystem that had consumed them. One of them spoke. A woman whose voice sounded like wind through branches. She told me they'd been waiting, aware the entire time they'd been buried, feeling themselves being used to nourish flowers that wealthy people admired. She told me about the root doctor who'd been buried among them, a woman who'd placed a working on the soil before she died, a curse that would activate when someone tried to restore Cornelius's garden. The plants had been listening all along, remembering every person buried beneath them, waiting for enough living matter to fuel the resurrection. And I'd given it to them. Every plant I'd added, every fertilizer application, every watering had fed the working, strengthened it, until there was enough life in the garden to pull the dead back through. They didn't kill me. What they did was worse. They showed me everyone who'd been buried there, made me know their names and stories. They made me understand that Cornelius hadn't just used the dead as fertilizer. He'd murdered people specifically for his experiments, chosen them based on which plants he wanted to grow, documented their deaths alongside his planting schedules. And then they gave me a choice. I could help them get justice, or I could join them in the soil and spend the next century feeding whatever grew above my grave. I became their gardener. I documented everything, photographed the bodies emerging from the roots, recorded their testimonies. I contacted journalists, historians, descendant communities. The Historical Society tried to cover it up at first. But there were too many witnesses by then. Too many plants blooming with impossible vitality. Too many people seeing things in that garden that couldn't be explained. The plantation was shut down, the restoration canceled. They wanted to tear everything up, remove the plants, properly excavate the burial ground. The plants wouldn't allow it. Every time someone tried to dig, the roots fought back, the vines attacked, the flowers released pollen that made people sick. So now I maintain it. I'm the only one the garden tolerates, because I know the names, because I tell the stories, because I've dedicated myself to making sure people understand what Cornelius Belmont did. The garden is open to descendants only now, a living memorial where the plants bloom with the strength of the people buried beneath them. The roses grow hands that reach toward the sky. The wisteria forms faces in its flowers. The boxwoods spell out names in languages that were stolen. It's beautiful and terrible, and I tend it every day, pruning and watering and apologizing. The dead have grown into something new here, something that won't let the past be buried again. And every time I work the soil, I feel them underneath, patient and permanent. Roots that run deeper than any garden ever could. Everyone in Moss Point has heard the story. The man with a hook for a hand who drags people into the water. The urban legend parents use to keep kids away from the docks after dark. The campfire tale that's been told so many times, nobody remembers where it started. I grew up with that story, laughed about it with my friends, used it to scare my little cousins. Then I came home after 4 years away at college, and I found out the Hookerman isn't a legend. He's real, he's patient, and my family helped create him. My name is Connor. I'm 22 years old, and I never planned to come back to this Mississippi fishing town. Moss Point is the kind of place where nothing changes, where people are born and die within the same 10-mile radius, where the smell of the Gulf and dead fish is so constant, you stop noticing it. I'd escaped to Ole Miss, got a degree in business, had job offers in Jackson and Memphis, places where the future actually existed. But my grandfather died. My grandmother begged me to come home for the summer, help her settle his affairs, spend some time with her before I disappeared into my new life. I said yes because I loved her, because I owed him, because I thought it would just be a few months of sorting through old papers and pretending to enjoy fishing. I didn't know my grandfather had been keeping the Hookerman fed. The marks started appearing the second night I was back. Scratches on my grandmother's front door, 3 parallel gouges in the wood that looked like they'd been made by something sharp and curved. My grandmother saw them and went pale, but she told me it was probably a raccoon, nothing to worry about. The next morning, there were marks on my truck, deep scratches in the paint running along the driver's side door. That afternoon, I found them on the dock where my grandfather used to keep his boat, carved into the wooden planks. Always 3 marks, always the same spacing, always at the height where a man's hand would naturally fall if he was dragging something sharp along a surface. My friends noticed too. I'd met up with Connor and Juliana, people I'd grown up with who'd never left, and they got quiet when I mentioned the marks. Connor finally admitted that this happened every time someone in my family died. Marks appearing around town, always connected to my family's property, always in 3s. His grandfather had told him it was the Hookerman, angry that his payment had stopped. I laughed, said that was ridiculous, demanded to know what he actually thought was happening. The look he gave me was pure pity. He told me to ask my grandmother about 1987, about what really happened to Thomas Mercer, about the deal the founding families made. My grandmother didn't want to talk about it. She cried when I pushed, said some stories should stay buried, said my grandfather had protected me from this knowledge for a reason. But I wouldn't let it go, and finally she took me to the attic and showed me a box of old newspapers, town records, and a journal written by my great-great-grandfather. Moss Point was founded in 1872 by 5 families who'd come to the Gulf Coast to make their fortune in fishing and shipping. Business was good for 20 years. But then the catches started failing. Boats started sinking. Workers started disappearing. The town was dying. That's when Thomas Mercer showed up. He wasn't from anywhere anyone could determine, just appeared at the docks one day looking for work. He was a good fisherman, better than anyone in town. But there was something wrong with him. He didn't speak much, avoided people, kept to himself in a shack at the edge of the water. The founding families hired him anyway, because they were desperate, and wherever Thomas went, the fish followed. His catches were so large they didn't seem possible. Other boats that fished near him started having luck again. The town's fortune reversed. For 5 years, Thomas Mercer saved Moss Point. Then the accident happened. Thomas was working on a processing line at the cannery when his hand got caught in the machinery. The injury was catastrophic, crushing bone and tearing flesh. The town doctor amputated, but the wound got infected. Thomas was dying, slowly and in agony, and he blamed the founding families. He said they'd used him, profited from his skills, and when he was broken, they'd thrown him away like trash. On his deathbed, he made a promise. He'd keep bringing fish to Moss Point, keep making sure the town prospered. But every generation, one of the founding families had to give him something in return. They had to choose someone to feed to the water, someone who'd never be found, whose death would be blamed on accident or disappearance. If they refused, if they broke the deal, Thomas would take everyone. I wanted to believe it was a myth, a story created to explain coincidental drownings in a town that lived on the water. But my grandmother showed me the records. Every 20 to 30 years since 1892, Someone connected to the founding families disappeared near the water. Always young, always healthy, always during the summer. And always, just before they vanished, there were reports of hook marks appearing around town. My grandfather's generation had chosen someone in 1987, a drifter passing through that nobody would miss. That's what the founding families had always done, selected people on the margins, people whose deaths wouldn't be investigated too closely. But my grandfather had been the last of his generation to die. And now there was no one left to make the choice except me. I told myself it was insane, that I wouldn't participate in some multi-generational murder conspiracy based on an urban legend. But the marks kept appearing, getting closer, more frequent. They showed up on my bedroom window, on my grandmother's car, carved into the tree outside where I used to have a tire swing. And I started seeing him. Just glimpses at first. A figure standing at the end of the dock at twilight, a silhouette in the fog rolling off the water at dawn. Always too far away to see clearly, but I could make out the shape of him. Tall and lean, with one arm ending in something that caught the light wrong, something curved and sharp. The other founding family descendants started calling me. Miriam Hartley, whose family owned the marina. Elise Chen, whose great-grandparents had run the general store. Noah Valdez, whose family had captained the fishing fleet. They were all around my age, all inheritors of this terrible secret, all terrified. They told me we had to meet, had to decide what to do, because the Hookerman was getting impatient. We gathered at the old cannery, the same building where Thomas Mercer had lost his hand, and they laid out the situation. The town was prospering, had been for over a century. The fish were always plentiful around Moss Point, never mind that other Gulf towns struggled. Businesses thrived, children were healthy, disasters that hit other coastal communities always seemed to miss us. The deal was working, had always worked, and all it cost was one life per generation. They'd already chosen someone. A homeless man who'd been camping near the boat launch, someone nobody would miss, someone whose disappearance would be written off as moving on. All we had to do was get him to the old dock at midnight, tell him there was work available, a boat that needed crewing. The Hookerman would do the rest. We'd fulfill the bargain, protect the town for another generation, protect our families. I looked at these people I'd grown up with, people I'd played with as children, and saw they were serious. They were actually planning to murder someone to appease an urban legend. I said no. I told them it was insane, that we couldn't kill someone based on a story, that we needed to break the cycle instead of continuing it. They looked at me like I'd signed all our death warrants. Miriam said I didn't understand, that refusing the Hookerman didn't mean he just went away. He took his payment one way or another, and if we didn't choose, he'd choose for us. He'd take family members, friends, anyone connected to the founding families. Would keep taking until the debt was paid in blood. I still said no. I left that cannery and drove straight to the police, ready to report what I'd heard, ready to expose the whole thing. I never made it to the station. My truck died half a mile from the cannery, just stopped running for no reason. I got out to check under the hood, and that's when I saw him clearly for the first time. Thomas Mercer, or what was left of him, standing 10 feet away in the middle of the empty road. He looked like something pulled from the water after decades submerged, skin gray and waterlogged, clothes rotted to rags. His right arm ended in a hook, but not a prosthetic one. It was metal, yes, but it had grown into his flesh, fused with the bone, become part of him. His eyes were milky white, blind but somehow seeing, and when he opened his mouth, water poured out along with words that sounded like they were traveling up from the bottom of the Gulf. He told me the deal was simple. One life, freely given by the founding families, in exchange for his protection. That's all it had ever been. A transaction that kept Moss Point alive when 100 other towns like it had dried up and died. He didn't want to hurt people, didn't enjoy the killing. But he died because the founding families had used him and discarded him, and this was the price of that sin, paid eternally. I could choose someone marginal, someone whose loss wouldn't be mourned. Or I could refuse and watch him take people I loved. My grandmother, my friends, everyone connected to the founding families. The choice was mine, but it had to be made before dawn, and dawn was only 3 hours away. I'm writing this from the old dock where my grandfather used to fish, where I spent countless summer mornings as a kid. It's almost dawn. I can see the Hookerman standing in the shallows, waiting. The others are here too, the descendants, watching to see what I'll do. There's a man with them, the homeless man they'd chosen, unconscious and tied up. They're giving me one last chance to do this their way, to continue the tradition. And I'm sitting here trying to decide if one life is worth the prosperity of an entire town, if I have the right to break a deal my ancestors made. If refusing to be part of a murder makes me noble or just selfishly willing to let others die instead. The sun is starting to rise. The Hookerman is walking toward the dock, and I still don't know what I'm going to do. But whatever happens in the next few minutes will either save Moss Point or destroy it. And there's no going back from either choice. The hook catches the dawn light, and he's climbing onto the dock now, and I have to decide right now who dies today. There's a house in Athens, Georgia that Google Maps shows as a green blur, satellite images can't penetrate, and every real estate database lists as sold despite never having a recorded transaction in 40 years. I'm a real estate agent. My name is Mateo. I'm 40 years old, and I thought I'd seen every kind of property disaster in my 15-year career. Hoarder houses, meth labs, murder scenes, structural nightmares that should have been condemned decades ago. But nothing prepared me for the house on Elderwood Lane, where the kudzu got inside and started digesting the family that lived there. The listing came through my office on a Tuesday in June, forwarded by a law firm in Atlanta handling an estate. The property had been in probate for 18 months, tangled up in legal complications that the lawyer wouldn't specify over the phone. They needed someone local to appraise it, provide photos for the court, assess whether it was salvageable or should be demolished. The address alone should have warned me off. Elderwood Lane was one of those roads that appeared on old maps but didn't seem to exist anymore, swallowed up by urban development or simply forgotten. I had to use a county plat map from 1985 to find it, a gravel driveway off a dead-end street that backed up to protected wetlands where nobody had built anything in decades. The house itself was a Victorian Gothic monstrosity. 3 stories of ornate woodwork and stained glass that had probably been stunning in 1890 and was now almost completely covered in kudzu. I'd seen kudzu-covered buildings before. It's the plague of the South, an invasive vine from Japan that grows a foot a day during summer and swallows everything in its path. Abandoned barns, old cars, entire forests get consumed by the stuff. But this was different. The kudzu on this house was denser than anything I'd encountered, so thick it looked like green fur, and it seemed to pulse slightly, like it was breathing. The smell hit me before I even got out of my truck. Sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers decomposing in the heat. I had keys from the law firm, but I couldn't find the front door at first. The kudzu had grown across every entrance, creating a solid wall of vegetation. I used hedge trimmers to cut through, and that's when I noticed the vines were warm. Not sun-warmed, but body temperature warm. and when I cut them, they seemed to recoil, pulling back from the blades. Sap ran from the cut stems that looked too thick, too dark, almost like blood. I told myself it was just plant matter, just normal biological processes, and pushed my way through the opening I'd created. The door behind the kudzu was unlocked, and when I stepped inside, I entered a world of perpetual green twilight. The kudzu was inside the house, not just creeping in through broken windows or gaps in the foundation, but fully established, growing up the walls, across the ceiling, covering every surface like wallpaper. The air was thick and humid, greenhouse warm, despite it being early morning. Sunlight filtered through the kudzu-covered windows in shafts of green light that made everything look underwater. I could hear movement all around me. The constant rustling of growing leaves, the creak of vines shifting position. Nothing should grow this vigorously indoors. Nothing should survive without proper soil and drainage. But the kudzu didn't seem to care about normal botanical rules. It was thriving. And as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized the house wasn't empty. There were people here, or what was left of people. I saw them throughout the first floor, partially absorbed into the kudzu growth, bodies wrapped in vines that had grown through their clothing and into their flesh. A woman in the living room, seated on a couch that no longer existed, her body held upright by the vines threaded through her torso. A man in the kitchen, standing at a stove that was buried in vegetation, his hand extended toward a kettle that had become a planter for kudzu flowers. A child on the stairs, one foot raised mid-step, frozen in the act of running. They'd been mummified by the plant growth, preserved in position like Pompeii victims, and the most horrible part was that they looked recent. Not decades-old corpses, but people who might have died within the last few years, their features still recognizable, their clothes not yet rotted away. I should have left immediately. I should have called the police, reported what I'd found, let professionals handle whatever nightmare this was. But I'm a real estate agent, which means I'm nosy by profession and stupid by habit. I needed to understand what had happened here, needed to document it for my report. I took photos, carefully moved through the kudzu-choked rooms, tried to piece together the timeline. I found mail on a table that was dated March 2023, utility bills in the name of Patterson, a family of 5 according to the address labels. The most recent piece of mail was from 2 years ago, which meant whatever had happened to the Pattersons had happened relatively recently, and nobody had noticed or cared enough to investigate. The kudzu grew thicker as I moved deeper into the house, the vines getting more aggressive, reaching toward me as I passed. I felt them brush against my arms, my neck, my face. Touch that was too deliberate, too seeking. In the dining room, I found where the kudzu had originated. A potted plant in the corner, an ornamental kudzu that someone had foolishly brought inside, probably as a conversation piece or southern kitsch. But this wasn't normal kudzu. The root system had broken through the pot and grown down into the floorboards, spreading throughout the house's structure. The roots were visible through gaps in the kudzu coverage, thick as my arm, pulsing with that same disturbing warmth I'd noticed outside. I found the journal in the master bedroom, written by Patricia Patterson, the mother. The entries started, normally enough, documenting their move into the house, her excitement about restoring a historic property, her husband's new job at the university. The kudzu plant had been a housewarming gift from a neighbor, an ironic decoration that they'd found amusing. It had grown quickly, faster than expected, and they'd enjoyed watching it spread across one wall of the dining room. They'd even fed it, she wrote, treating it like a pet, giving it water and fertilizer and affection. That's when things started changing. The kudzu began growing outside its designated area, spreading to other rooms despite their efforts to prune it back. It grew faster at night, they realized, and seemed to respond to their presence, vines turning toward them when they entered a room. Patricia's husband thought it was phototropism, the plant seeking light. But Patricia wasn't sure. The kudzu seemed aware, seemed to be learning their patterns, their routines. Then their youngest child, Emma, age 7, went missing inside the house. They searched for hours, tearing through the kudzu growth that had filled the first floor, and found her unconscious in the dining room, wrapped in vines that had grown around her while she napped. She was unharmed, but changed, Patricia wrote. Quieter, more distant. And she spent all her time near the kudzu, talking to it like it could understand. The journal entries became more frantic after that. The whole family was changing, spending more time in the kudzu-covered rooms, sitting still for hours while the vines grew around them. Patricia's husband said it was peaceful, meditative, like the plant was sharing something with them. Patricia tried to leave, tried to take the children and run, but she couldn't make herself go. The kudzu had gotten into her somehow, she wrote, into all of them. She could feel it growing inside her thoughts, putting down roots in her mind, making her want to stay, to sit still, to let it grow. The final entry was barely legible. It's not killing us. It's keeping us. We're part of the house now, part of the ecosystem. We feed it, and it preserves us. I can feel my family all around me, connected through the roots. We're not separate anymore. The sentence ended there. I backed out of the bedroom slowly, journal clutched in my hand, trying not to panic. The kudzu had grown across the doorway while I'd been reading, vines forming a loose net that I had to push through. They clung to me, wrapped around my wrists, my ankles, surprisingly strong. I pulled free and ran for the stairs. But the house had changed. The kudzu had grown thicker, the pathways I'd used to navigate were overgrown, and the bodies I'd seen earlier were closer somehow, like they'd moved while I wasn't looking. The woman on the couch turned her head, I swear she turned her head, and looked at me with eyes that were more plant than human, green and photosynthetic and aware. The house didn't want me to leave. Every exit I tried was blocked by kudzu that grew back faster than I could cut it, vines that grabbed at my clothes and skin, flowers that released pollen that made my head swim and my thoughts slow. I could feel it trying to do to me what it had done to the Pattersons, trying to make me want to stay, to sit down, to let it grow through me and preserve me like the others. Part of me wanted to. Part of me thought it would be peaceful, thought being absorbed into something larger than myself would solve all my problems, all my stress and fear and loneliness. I fought that feeling with everything I had, used my hedge trimmers like a machete, and finally broke through a window on the second floor. I fell 15 feet into more kudzu that cushioned my landing and immediately tried to wrap around me. I crawled, then ran, tearing myself free from vines that seemed to chase me across the overgrown lawn. I made it to my truck, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove away without looking back. When I got home, I found kudzu leaves in my pockets, in my hair, stuck to my skin. I burned everything I'd been wearing, scrubbed myself raw in the shower, threw away the journal and the photos. I told the law firm I couldn't appraise the property, that it was too dangerous, that it needed to be demolished immediately. They said they'd handle it. But when I checked county records a month later, the property still showed as sold, still existed in that legal limbo where nobody could touch it. I drive past Elderwood Lane sometimes, can't help myself, and the kudzu is bigger now. It spread beyond the house, consuming the neighboring lots, creeping toward the main road. Sometimes I see shapes moving inside that green mass, people-shaped shadows that might be the Pattersons or might be others who got too close. And sometimes, late at night, I feel something growing inside me, putting down roots in my thoughts, making me want to go back. I haven't gone yet, but the feeling gets stronger every day. And I'm terrified that one morning I'll wake up and drive to the house and walk into that green darkness and finally understand what the Pattersons learned. That the kudzu doesn't just consume, it collects, it preserves, and it's still hungry. Prayer couldn't save my farm, but witchcraft might damn my soul. And I've got exactly 3 days to decide which matters more. I'm Dawson, 50 years old, fourth-generation farmer working 300 acres of wiregrass country in southeast Alabama. And I've been a God-fearing Baptist my entire life. Never missed a Sunday service, raised my children in the church, believed with absolute certainty that there was right and wrong, good and evil, salvation and damnation. Then my crops started dying under perfect conditions, my livestock started wasting away despite good feed, and my family started facing bankruptcy for reasons that made no agricultural sense. That's when I heard about the woman who lives in the burned-out church at the crossroads, the one my pastor says will drag me to hell, but who might be the only thing standing between my family and ruin. The drought shouldn't be killing my cotton. We've had adequate rain, good irrigation, soil tests that show perfect nutrient levels. My neighbors' crops are struggling too, but mine are dying faster, withering in the fields like something is drinking the life out of them from below. The cattle are worse. I've lost 15 head in 3 months to no disease the vet can identify. Animals just lying down one day and refusing to get up, their eyes going dull and empty before they stop breathing. My wife is exhausted from working double shifts at the hospital trying to cover our losses. My son dropped out of college to come home and help. My daughter stopped talking about her dreams of vet school and started looking at technical schools she can afford. I'm watching my family's legacy die, and every prayer I offer up seems to hit the ceiling and fall back down unanswered. People started whispering at church, the kind of whispers that stop when you walk into a room. Someone suggested my land was cursed, that maybe I'd done something to offend the Lord, that this was judgment for some unconfessed sin. The pastor came by for a home visit and basically said the same thing more politely, suggested I examine my conscience and make things right with God. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream that I'd been faithful my entire life, that I'd tithed when I couldn't afford it, that I'd served on every committee and volunteered for every church function, that if this was God's reward for devotion, then the whole system was broken. I didn't say any of that. I thanked him for his concern and showed him out. And then I sat in my kitchen and cried for the first time since my father died. That's when my farmhand Calvin told me about the witch. He'd worked for my family for 20 years, never spoke much about his own beliefs. But he came to me that evening and said there were other ways to solve problems like mine. He said there was a woman who lived out in the wiregrass, in what was left of an old church that had burned down in the 1960s. And she knew things the preachers didn't want to admit existed. She could help, he said, but it would cost me. Not money necessarily, but something. He wouldn't say what. He just gave me directions, told me to go at dusk, and warned me that once I asked for her help, I couldn't undo it. I told him I wasn't interested in witchcraft or devil worship or whatever backward superstition he was suggesting. He looked at me with something like pity and said, "Suit yourself. But your faith ain't saving your farm, and pride ain't gonna feed your family." I lasted 2 more weeks before I went. 2 weeks of watching more cattle die, more crops fail, more bills pile up that I couldn't pay. 2 weeks of my wife's face getting more drawn and tired, my children's dreams getting smaller and more practical. 2 weeks of praying to a God who seemed to have turned his back on everything I'd built. I drove out to the crossroads at dusk on a Wednesday, feeling like Peter denying Christ, feeling like Judas counting silver, feeling like I was about to step across a line that I could never step back over. The burned church was exactly where Calvin said it would be. Skeleton walls of blackened brick surrounding a space that should have been open to the sky, but somehow felt enclosed, oppressive, thick with presence. She was waiting inside, though I hadn't called ahead or announced I was coming. Just sitting in what would have been a pew if any furniture had survived the fire, looking like she could be anywhere from 30 to 60. Skin dark as the burned walls around her, eyes that reflected the last light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. She knew my name. She knew why I'd come. She knew I was Baptist and terrified and desperate enough to be there anyway. She smiled, not unkindly, and asked me what I was willing to trade for my farm's salvation. I told her I didn't have much money. She laughed and said money was worthless to her, that she dealt in other currencies. Faith, she said, conviction, the certainty that I knew right from wrong. Those were valuable things, and she could work with them. She told me she could fix my problem, could make my crops grow and my cattle thrive and my family prosper. But I had to understand what I was asking for. She didn't serve the devil, she said, wasn't interested in souls or damnation or any of that Christian mythology. She worked with older powers, things that had been in the wiregrass long before churches and crosses, things that didn't care about human morality but would honor a proper exchange. She could give me 7 years of prosperity, guaranteed. My crops would never fail, my livestock would be healthy, my family would want for nothing. But at the end of 7 years, I would owe payment. Not money, not my soul, but service. I would have to do something for her, something she wouldn't specify in advance, something that would go against everything I believed in. If I refused when the time came, everything she'd given me would reverse, and worse. I asked what worse meant. She smiled again and said, my crops wouldn't just fail, they'd poison the land so nothing would grow for generations. My livestock wouldn't just die, they'd spread disease to every farm in the county. My family wouldn't just lose prosperity, they'd lose each other, drawn apart by circumstances that would seem like bad luck, but would be meticulously arranged. She wasn't threatening me, she said. She was explaining the terms. This was business, a contract, and both parties had to honor it or face consequences. 7 years of guaranteed prosperity in exchange for one act of service at the end. Yes or no? No negotiation, no fine print, just a simple choice. I said yes. God forgive me, I said yes. We didn't sign anything in blood or perform any dramatic ritual. She just nodded, told me to go home, and said I'd see results by morning. I drove back feeling sick, feeling like I'd betrayed everything I believed in, already composing the confession I'd never be able to make at church. But when I got home, my wife met me at the door, crying with relief. One of the cattle that had been dying had gotten up and was eating normally. The vet had just called, baffled and unable to explain it. I went out to check the cotton fields with a flashlight, and even in the darkness, I could see they looked healthier, fuller, like they'd recovered a month of growth in a few hours. The prosperity was real. Over the next 6 months, my farm went from failing to thriving. Every crop I planted grew with impossible vigor. Every calf was healthy, every cow produced abundantly. My yields were so high, I started to attract attention, agricultural companies asking about my techniques, university researchers wanting to study my land. I gave vague answers about crop rotation and soil management, avoided the questions about why my success seemed to defy every agricultural principle. My family's life improved dramatically. My son went back to college. My daughter started talking about vet school again. My wife quit her second job and started sleeping through the night. We paid off debts, made improvements, started planning for a future that had seemed impossible just months before. But I couldn't enjoy it. Every Sunday at church felt like torture. Sitting in the pew knowing what I'd done, listening to sermons about faith and righteousness, while my prosperity grew from roots I didn't want to examine. I started having dreams about the end of the 7 years, about what she might ask me to do. Would she tell me to hurt someone? To commit murder? To denounce God publicly? Every possibility was terrible, and I had no way of knowing, no way to prepare. The contract was open-ended, and I'd signed it in desperation without understanding what I was really agreeing to. 6 years and 9 months have passed now. 3 months left before payment comes due. The farm is more successful than it's ever been. My family is happy and secure. And I'm dying inside with dread and guilt. I tried going back to the burned church to ask what she'll require. But she's never there when I visit. Calvin just shakes his head when I ask him about it, says the terms were clear and I have to wait until she calls in the debt. I've thought about running, about selling the farm and leaving Alabama, but I know that won't save me. I've thought about going to my pastor and confessing everything. But what would he do? Pray over me? Perform an exorcism? Tell me I'm damned? None of that changes the contract. Last night I dreamed about her for the first time in months. She was standing in my cotton field, and the plants were growing up around her legs, through her clothes, like she and the crops were connected, like my prosperity was literally rooted in her. She looked at me and said, "Soon. That's all. Just soon." I woke up drenched in sweat, my wife asking if I was okay. And I lied again like I've been lying for 7 years. I'm not okay. I'm terrified. Because I know that when she calls in the debt, it won't be anything simple. It won't be anything I can do without destroying the person I've always believed myself to be. 3 months left, and I'm standing at a crossroads worse than the one where her church stands. Do I honor the contract and do whatever terrible thing she asks, preserving my family's prosperity at the cost of my conscience? Do I refuse and watch everything she gave me turn to poison, destroying not just my family but potentially my whole community? Or is there a third option, something I haven't thought of? Some way to outmaneuver a witch who's been playing this game longer than I've been alive. I'm praying again, desperately. But I don't know if God listens to men who've made deals with things older than religion. All I know is the cotton is growing higher than ever. The cattle are fat and healthy, and my family is smiling at dinner while I count down the days until payment comes due and discover exactly what my soul is worth. They were standing in perfect circles when I found them, waist deep in black swamp water, 50 yards from the nearest dry land, singing in harmonies that shouldn't be possible from human throats. I'm Leon, I'm 32 years old, and I've been a wildlife officer in the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge for 8 years. I've pulled drowning victims from cypress swamps, wrestled alligators away from tourists, tracked black bears through terrain that would swallow a person whole. I thought I knew this swamp, thought I understood its dangers. I was wrong. The Okefenokee is older than human civilization, and there's something at its heart that's been waiting in the water since before we had words to name it. The first hiker went missing on a Tuesday in July. Marcus Brennan, 38, experienced outdoorsman, had filed a proper backcountry permit for a 3-day solo trip through the eastern sections of the refuge. When he didn't check out on time, we initiated standard search protocols. His last known position was near Billy's Lake, a section of swamp where the water runs the color of strong tea from tannic acid, where the cypress trees grow so thick you can't see 20 feet in any direction, where the ecosystem is basically unchanged from what it was 10,000 years ago. We found his campsite undisturbed, his gear still packed properly, his satellite phone on the ground showing full battery but no outgoing calls. It was like he'd simply stood up and walked into the swamp. The second hiker disappeared 4 days later. Then a third. Then 2 more in the same week. All experienced, all properly equipped, all vanishing from different sections of the refuge with no signs of struggle or distress. The National Park Service brought in additional rangers, search and rescue teams, even cadaver dogs. Nothing. The swamp was swallowing people, and we had no explanation that made sense. No bodies, no tracks, no evidence of alligator attacks or accidental drownings. Just empty campsites and grieving families demanding answers we couldn't provide. The media started calling it the Okefenokee Mystery, and speculation ranged from serial killers to government conspiracies to mass suicide pacts. None of it felt right to me. I started noticing the sound on the 5th night of searching. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the normal swamp chorus of frogs and insects and birds. A low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the water and air. The other searchers didn't mention it, but I saw one of them pause and tilt his head, like he was trying to identify something just beyond his hearing range. That night, back at the ranger station, I couldn't sleep. The humming was in my head now, repetitive and almost melodic, and I found myself wanting to go back out into the swamp to follow it to its source. I forced myself to stay in bed, told myself it was exhaustion and stress, but the urge was strong enough to scare me. The next day I went out alone, against protocol, following the sound that only I seemed to hear clearly. I took a flat-bottomed boat deep into the refuge, past the marked trails and tourist areas, into sections where the cypress knees rise from the water, like ancient sculptures, and the Spanish moss hangs so thick it blocks out the sun. The water here was perfectly still, creating mirror reflections that made it impossible to tell where the swamp ended and the sky began. I cut the motor and drifted listening. The humming was louder now, resolving into distinct tones, multiple voices harmonizing in ways that made my chest vibrate. I followed it for 3 hours, deeper than I'd ever gone, into water that my GPS showed as unmapped territory, places that shouldn't exist according to our refuge surveys. That's when I found them. The missing hikers, all 7 of them, standing in 3 concentric circles in waist-deep water. They were alive, conscious, their eyes open and tracking my approach. But they didn't acknowledge me or call for help. They just kept singing, voices blending in harmonies that shouldn't be physically possible, producing overtones and resonances that made the water ripple in geometric patterns. Their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies swaying slightly in unison, and their faces were expressions of absolute ecstasy. They looked like they'd found something transcendent, something worth more than rescue or survival or returning to the world they'd left behind. I called out to them, shouted names, demanded they acknowledge me. Nothing. I moved my boat closer, close enough to see that their skin had taken on a strange quality, slightly translucent, like they were beginning to blend with the water around them. Their clothes were rotting off their bodies, but they seemed unaware or uncaring. I reached out to grab Marcus Brennan's arm, the first hiker who disappeared, and my hand went through him like he was made of smoke or fog. He was there, solid enough to see and hear, but not solid enough to touch. He'd crossed some barrier between physical and something else, and the swamp was claiming him inch by inch. The singing changed when I tried to touch them, shifting into a different harmonic, and I realized that they were responding to my presence. They wanted me to join them. The harmonies were designed to be irresistible, to create neurological responses that bypassed conscious thought. I could feel the urge building in me, the desire to step out of my boat and wade into the circle, to add my voice to theirs and become part of whatever they'd become part of. It would be easy, the singing promised. It would be peaceful. I would understand everything, would become connected to something vast and ancient, would never be alone or afraid or confused again. All I had to do was step into the water and open my mouth and sing. I forced myself to start the boat motor, the mechanical sound breaking the spell for just long enough to let me turn away. The hikers didn't try to stop me, just kept singing as I fled, their voices following me for miles through the swamp. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was shaking so badly I could barely file my report. I told my supervisor I'd found the missing hikers, gave exact coordinates, said they were alive but in some kind of trance and would need immediate medical evacuation. The response team went out within the hour. Helicopters, boats, EMTs, the whole operation. They found the location easily enough. But the hikers were gone. Just empty water and cypress trees, and not a trace that anyone had been there. They didn't believe me. The other rangers looked at me with concern and pity, suggested I take some time off, said the stress of the searches had gotten to me. My supervisor quietly recommended a psychiatric evaluation. I went through the motions, talked to a counselor, took a week of leave. But I could still hear the singing. It was fainter now, distant, but always there in quiet moments, calling me back. And I knew I wasn't crazy, because 2 days after the failed rescue attempt, another hiker went missing, then another, then 3 more in one night. The disappearances were accelerating, and I was the only one who understood why. I went back to the swamp alone, at night, without permission or backup. I brought recording equipment, underwater cameras, anything that might document what I was experiencing. I found the hikers again, but there were more of them now. 15 people standing in those concentric circles, and the circles had expanded outward. They were building something, I realized. Creating a structure made of sound and water and human bodies, a formation that served some purpose I couldn't comprehend. The newest additions were still mostly solid, still looked human. But the ones who'd been there longest were almost transparent, their bodies dissolving into the swamp while their voices remained strong and clear. I set up my cameras and started recording, determined to get proof that would force the authorities to take this seriously. That's when I saw what was in the center of the circles. Something massive. Something that had been underwater so long it had become part of the swamp ecosystem, covered in moss and algae and centuries of accumulated debris. But it was moving now, responding to the singing, rising slowly toward the surface. It was organic but not quite alive, ancient but not quite dead, and as it emerged I understood that the hikers weren't the ones singing. They were being sung through, used as instruments to voice something that predated language, that existed before humans came to this swamp and would exist long after we were gone. The thing in the center opened what might have been eyes or might have been apertures, and it looked at me with intelligence that was vast and alien and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The hikers' singing reached a crescendo, and I felt my own voice, joining involuntarily, felt words coming out of my mouth in languages I didn't know, felt the overwhelming urge to step into the water and complete the circle. My camera was still recording, capturing everything. And the last rational part of my mind knew that this footage would be my vindication or my epitaph, depending on whether I survived the next few minutes. I ran. Again. Abandoning my equipment, my dignity, my duty as a ranger. I fled through the swamp like something was chasing me. And maybe something was. Because I could feel the water itself reaching for me, trying to pull me down and make me part of its song. I made it back to my truck somehow, drove out of the refuge without stopping, and didn't look back until I was 50 miles away in a motel parking lot in Waycross, Georgia. That was 3 days ago. The cameras and recording equipment are still out there, either documenting the transformation of those hikers into something else, or destroyed by whatever dwells at the heart of the Okefenokee. More hikers have gone missing since then. The count is up to 23 now, and the Park Service has closed large sections of the refuge pending investigation. I should go back. Should tell them what I know. Should try to stop whatever is happening. But I can still hear the singing, louder now, closer, and I know that if I go back into that swamp, I won't come out. Not as myself anyway. I'll join the circles, add my voice to the choir, dissolve into the black water until I'm nothing but sound and memory, and part of something that the Okefenokee has been growing since before humans gave it a name. The swamp is alive, and it's hungry, and it's calling people home to become part of its ancient song. And the worst part is that sometimes, in my dreams, I hear myself singing back, and it sounds like coming home. The children are getting sick with diseases that haven't existed in 70 years. And I'm the one who brought them back. My name is Dean. I'm 38 years old. And 3 months ago, I opened a rural health clinic in Clarksdale, Mississippi, with the best of intentions and the arrogance of someone who thought good medicine could heal old wounds. I was wrong. Some wounds don't heal. They fester underground, poisoning everything they touch, and when you disturb them, they spread like infection through generations. The clinic I opened used to be something else, something terrible. And the patients I'm trying to save are paying for sins committed long before they were born. I came to the Delta with a purpose. I'd spent 10 years working emergency medicine in Memphis, watching patients from poor rural areas show up in crisis because they had no access to basic health care. I wanted to change that. Wanted to bring quality medicine to underserved communities. Wanted to make a difference in the way that sounds naive when you say it out loud, but felt righteous when I was planning it. I found the perfect building in Clarksdale, an abandoned medical facility that had been empty since the 1980s, solid brick construction with good bones and enough space to house a full primary care practice. The price was absurdly low, which should have been my first warning. But I told myself it was just economic reality in a depressed area. I bought it, renovated it, hired staff, and opened the Delta Health Center with genuine belief that I was doing something good. The first patient who got sick was a 6-year-old girl named Elena. She came in with what looked like measles, which was unusual but not impossible despite vaccination programs. But the presentation was wrong. The rash was more severe than modern measles, the fever higher, the progression faster. Within 2 days, she developed complications that I'd only read about in historical medical texts. The kind of aggressive measles that killed children in the 1940s before modern treatment protocols. We hospitalized her, threw everything we had at it, and barely saved her life. I chalked it up to an unusual case. Maybe an especially virulent strain, maybe underlying immune issues we hadn't identified. Then 3 more children came in with the same presentation. Then 7. Then 15. They weren't all getting measles. Some developed diphtheria, which I'd never actually seen in a living patient because it was functionally eradicated in the United States. Some had whooping cough so severe it fractured their ribs. Some had scarlet fever, tuberculosis, polio-like paralysis. They were getting diseases from another era, from before antibiotics and vaccines and modern medicine. And they were getting them in waves that suggested coordinated outbreaks. The CDC got involved, confused and alarmed, testing for bioterrorism or some new pathogen. But the diseases were old, genetically identical to historical strains, like someone had preserved bacteria from the 1940s and was systematically releasing them into my patient population. I started researching the building's history, digging through county records and newspaper archives. What I found made my blood run cold. From 1932 to 1952, the facility hadn't been a regular clinic. It had been a research station, loosely affiliated with public health services, but operating with minimal oversight. The doctor who'd run it, a man named Elise Carmichael, had been conducting experiments on the local black population under the guise of free medical care. He'd been studying the progression of untreated diseases, deliberately withholding treatment from patients who trusted him, documenting how infections spread and killed when left to run their natural course. It was parallel to the Tuskegee syphilis study, but smaller, more isolated, and completely unknown to modern historians. Carmichael had infected children with measles, exposed them to tuberculosis, given them contaminated food that caused typhoid, all while pretending to treat them and taking meticulous notes on their suffering and death. The experiments had been discovered in 1952 by a visiting inspector, and Carmichael had been quietly removed, his records seized, the facility shut down. But no one had been prosecuted. No families had been notified. The whole thing had been buried, classified as a public health embarrassment that would undermine confidence in medical institutions if it became public. The building had sat empty for decades, used briefly as storage in the 70s and 80s before being abandoned completely, until I'd bought it and turned it back into a clinic, putting sick children in the same rooms where children had been deliberately infected 70 years ago. I found Carmichael's lab in the basement. The renovation crew had sealed it off, thinking it was just old storage. But when I broke through the wall, I found it perfectly preserved. Examination tables with leather restraints, cabinets full of culture samples, sealed vials containing pathogens that should have been destroyed generations ago, but remained viable in the cool, dark environment. A desk with journals documenting every experiment, every child infected, every death. Carmichael had been methodical, brilliant in a monstrous way, and completely untroubled by conscience. He'd written about his test subjects like they were laboratory animals, noting symptoms and progressions with clinical detachment while children died in agony. And I realized, with horror that made me vomit in that basement laboratory, that something was releasing those pathogens now. The sealed vials were opening, not through decay or accident, but deliberately. I watched it happen. A vial of diphtheria bacteria that had been sealed for 70 years cracked along its length while I stared at it, the seal breaking from the inside out, like something was pushing it open. The contents vaporized, becoming aerosol, spreading through the basement ventilation system that connected to my clinic upstairs, where children were waiting in the pediatric ward. The building was doing this. Not some person or organization, but the building itself, or something in it. Something that had absorbed decades of suffering and experimentation and death. The children who died in Carmichael's experiments had never been memorialized, never been acknowledged, never been given justice. Their deaths had been covered up and forgotten, and their anger had soaked into the walls and floors and foundation. Now that the building was a clinic again, now that children were coming here for healing, the past was making sure history repeated itself. The diseases Carmichael had used to torture test subjects were being released to torture the descendants of those communities. A curse born from institutional cruelty and buried trauma. I tried to evacuate the clinic immediately. I pulled fire alarms, called emergency services, tried to get every patient out of the building. But the doors wouldn't open properly, jamming at critical moments. The phones kept dying. Parents got confused about directions, wandered into wrong sections, brought children deeper into the building instead of out. It was like the structure itself was resisting, fighting to keep its victims inside where the diseases could spread efficiently. I physically carried children out one by one, my staff helping. But it was like wading through water that got thicker the closer we got to exits. We saved most of them. Most, but not all. 3 children died that night of diseases that shouldn't exist in modern America, their small bodies overwhelmed by infections from another era. The CDC quarantined the building, sent in hazmat teams, discovered the laboratory and its contents. The story broke nationally. Another chapter in America's history of medical racism. Another institution exposed for historic atrocities. Carmichael was long dead, but his victims finally had names and recognition. Families finally had answers about grandparents and great-grandparents who'd gone to a clinic for help and never come home. But the diseases didn't stop. Even with the building condemned and sealed, children in Clarksdale kept getting sick. Not as many and not as severely, but enough to show that the curse wasn't tied to the building alone. It had spread into the community, into the soil and water, into the generational trauma that connects descendants to ancestors. The children who'd been in my clinic during the outbreak carried something back to their homes, not bacteria, but memory. And that memory was making them sick. They were inheriting the suffering of children who died 70 years ago, experiencing symptoms that were psychosomatic and supernatural at the same time. Real diseases born from historical wounds that never healed. I closed my practice. Not just the clinic, but my medical license. I couldn't practice medicine anymore, couldn't trust my own judgment after what I'd done. I'd thought I was bringing healing to a community that needed it, but instead I'd reopened an old wound and poured salt into it. The road to hell isn't just paved with good intentions. It's built on foundations of unacknowledged evil, and no amount of modern kindness can fix what institutions destroyed. The Delta Health Center building was demolished 4 months ago, every brick hauled away and disposed of as hazardous material. The site blessed by religious leaders from a dozen traditions and left vacant. But I still see the children, not physically, but in my dreams, in my memories. The ones I saved and the ones I didn't. They look at me with eyes that ask why I thought I could help, why I assumed good intentions were enough, why I didn't understand that some places are too poisoned by the past to ever be used for good again. Medical racism didn't end when Carmichael was removed, or when the building was closed, or when the experiments were finally exposed. It continued in the poverty that prevented adequate health care, in the mistrust that kept people from seeking treatment, in the generational trauma that literally makes people sick. And I participated in it, not through malice, but through ignorance, which in some ways is worse because ignorance can always be corrected if you're willing to look. I work in a library now, in the archives, helping researchers document medical experiments on marginalized populations. It's the only penance I can manage, the only way I know to prevent future doctors from making my mistakes. But sometimes, late at night, I hear children coughing with that distinctive whooping cough sound. or I smell the antiseptic and disease scent of Carmichael's laboratory, and I know that what I unleashed isn't finished. The Delta remembers everything, and it's teaching its children to remember too, one disease at a time. I went to expose a charlatan and discovered that demons are absolutely real, terrifyingly physical, and now they know my face. My name is Evan. I'm 26 years old, and I'm a journalist who specializes in investigating religious fraud. I've exposed faith healers who use hidden earpieces, prosperity preachers who launder money through their ministries, and televangelists who prey on the desperate. I'm a skeptic by profession and an atheist by conviction. And when I heard about the revival preacher drawing thousands to a tent in the Florida Panhandle with claims of genuine demon expulsion, I saw an easy story. Drive down, document the con, write the expose, move on to the next fraud. Except the preacher wasn't faking anything. The demons he was casting out were horrifyingly real. And when he lost control of the service, they came for everyone in that tent, including me. The revival was being held outside Pensacola, in a massive tent that could hold 2,000 people, set up in a clearing that had probably been a farm field before the preacher rented it. The man's name was Nathaniel Cross, and he'd appeared on the revival circuit about 6 months ago with no history, no credentials, no connection to any established ministry. He just showed up with his tent and his message, claiming God had given him power over unclean spirits, and people started coming. Not the usual revival crowd of committed believers looking for entertainment, but desperate people. People who'd exhausted medical options, psychiatric care, traditional therapy. People who believed they or their loved ones were genuinely possessed and saw Cross as their last hope. I arrived early, before the service started, watching people file in. They looked haunted, most of them, carrying the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than lack of sleep. Parents with children who wouldn't speak or wouldn't stop screaming. Spouses supporting partners who seemed only partially present, eyes distant and movements jerky. Young adults who looked at the tent like it was either salvation or their final disappointment. I positioned myself in the middle section with my phone set to record, notebook ready, prepared to document another religious scam. The tent filled quickly, packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles. The heat was oppressive, even with the sides rolled up. That thick Florida humidity that makes breathing feel like drowning in air. The smell of sweat and desperation was overwhelming. Nathaniel Cross walked in without fanfare, just stepped up to the platform at the front and looked out at the crowd. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the kind of face that could be preaching or selling cars. Unremarkable except for his eyes. They were wrong somehow. Too bright, too focused, like he was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. He didn't do the usual revival routine, no music-building excitement, no emotional manipulation, no working the crowd into a frenzy. He just started talking in a normal voice that somehow carried to every corner of that massive tent. He said he wasn't there to entertain anyone or make them feel good. He was there to do violent spiritual work, to engage in warfare against entities that didn't want to leave their hosts, and anyone who wasn't prepared for that should leave now. Nobody left. He started calling people forward, not randomly, but specifically, pointing to individuals in the crowd and naming them. Not their given names, but other names. Words that sounded like language, but weren't English or Spanish or anything I recognized. The first person he called was a woman in her 30s, and when she walked down the aisle, something about her movement was off. Too fluid and too stiff at the same time, like she was being operated by someone learning how to use a body. Cross didn't lay hands on her or pray over her gently. He grabbed her by the shoulders and started speaking, not in tongues, but in commands, direct and forceful. The woman's body convulsed, and her voice changed, dropped 2 octaves, and spoke in that same not-quite language Cross had used. They were having a conversation, the preacher and something speaking through the woman, and the thing in her was not happy about being addressed. What happened next shouldn't be possible according to everything I believed about reality. The woman's body contorted in ways joints don't bend, her spine arching backward until her head touched her heels. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and her mouth opened impossibly wide. The voice coming out of her was multiple voices now, overlapping, arguing, screaming. Cross kept speaking, kept commanding, and suddenly the woman vomited. Not normal vomit, but something black and moving, something that hit the ground and scattered like insects, hundreds of small dark shapes that tried to crawl toward the crowd before dissolving into smoke. The woman collapsed, breathing normally, looking confused and exhausted but fundamentally different, like something heavy had been lifted off her. I wanted to believe it was theater, a performance arranged in advance. But I'd been watching that woman before Cross called her forward, seen her family supporting her, seen the genuine terror and hope in their faces. And the things that came out of her, the black shapes that moved with purpose before disappearing, those weren't special effects. I'd been filming everything, and when I checked my phone, the footage was corrupted, showing only static during the expulsion. My journalist brain was screaming that there had to be an explanation. But my body was having a different reaction, skin crawling with primitive fear that evolution had given me for recognizing predators. Cross called forward more people. A teenage boy who spoke in that not language and tried to attack the preacher with strength that took 4 men to restrain. An elderly man who actually floated 3 feet off the ground, while Cross commanded whatever was in him to leave. A young woman whose skin rippled like something was moving underneath it, pressing against her flesh from the inside, trying to get out. Each expulsion was violent, physical, undeniable. And with each one, the atmosphere in the tent changed. The air got thicker, harder to breathe, like pressure was building. The temperature dropped despite the Florida heat, my breath suddenly visible in fog. People in the crowd started getting agitated, not emotionally, but physically, bodies jerking and twitching involuntarily. That's when I realized what was happening. Cross wasn't destroying the demons he was expelling. He was forcing them out of their hosts, but they were still in the tent, invisible but present, looking for new people to inhabit. The expulsions were creating a spiritual crisis. Dozens or hundreds of entities suddenly displaced and desperate. I saw it spreading through the crowd like contagion, people's eyes going distant or too focused, voices changing pitch, bodies moving wrong. The revival was losing control, becoming a mass possession event, and Cross was in the center of it, still calling people forward like he couldn't see or didn't care that he was triggering a catastrophe. A man 3 seats away from me stood up and turned toward the aisle, moving in that same controlled but wrong way the first woman had moved. Then a woman behind me, then a child in the front row. They were all walking toward Cross, but not for healing. They were converging on him, the things inside them coordinating an attack. I should have run. Every rational instinct said to get out of that tent immediately. But I'm a journalist, and I was still filming, still documenting, still stupidly believing I could maintain observer status while reality collapsed around me. Cross saw them coming and changed tactics. He stopped calling individuals and started speaking to the entire tent, his voice rising to a shout, commanding every unclean spirit to manifest and depart. That's when all hell broke loose, literally. Everyone who was possessed or partially possessed or harboring something they didn't know about started reacting simultaneously. Hundreds of people convulsing, screaming in multiple voices, attacking each other or themselves. The tent structure shook like something was hitting it from outside, canvas walls billowing inward like massive lungs breathing. The air filled with that black moving substance, more of it than should fit inside the space, and it had formed now, almost recognizable. Shapes like hands and faces pressing against invisible barriers. I felt it when one of them noticed me. Not saw me, but noticed me. Recognized that I didn't belong, that I wasn't a believer seeking help, but a skeptic, documenting their exposure. Something cold and hateful focused on me specifically. And suddenly my body wasn't entirely my own. My hand reached for the pocket knife I carry, opening it without my conscious decision, moving the blade toward my throat with steady pressure. I was watching myself try to commit suicide. Unable to stop it, unable to even scream a warning. Part of my mind was still rational, still observing, noting that this was impossible and happening anyway. Cross appeared in front of me, moving through the chaos like it wasn't there. He grabbed my wrist, stopped the knife inches from my carotid artery, and spoke directly to whatever was controlling my arm. The thing inside me responded, using my voice to say things I didn't understand, threats or curses or claims in that not language. The preacher didn't look afraid or angry, just tired and resigned. Like this happened constantly, and he was exhausted by it. He said something that made my body convulse, made my mouth open and release a scream that wasn't mine. And then the cold presence was gone, expelled forcefully and furiously. I collapsed, breathing hard, still holding the knife, but my hand, my own again. Cross moved on to the next person, the next possession, working through the crowd systematically. It took hours. People fled the tent or remained paralyzed with fear. Emergency services arrived to chaos they couldn't begin to process. By the time it was over, the tent was half empty, littered with exhausted people and puddles of that black substance that was already evaporating. Cross stood at the front, swaying with exhaustion, and said to those of us remaining that this was the work, this was spiritual warfare, and anyone who couldn't handle it should stop coming. I left Florida that night, drove straight through to Atlanta, put 800 miles between myself and that tent before I could breathe normally. But distance doesn't matter. The thing that was in me, even briefly, left a mark. I can feel it sometimes, especially at night, like a door in my mind that didn't exist before. And something on the other side is testing the lock. I can hear them now. The entities that cross fights, the things that inhabit people and feed on suffering. They're everywhere, more common than anyone wants to admit. And now that I've seen them, they can see me. I'm not a skeptic anymore. I'm a terrified believer in things I wish didn't exist. And I know that demons are real. And they remember the journalist who watched them being expelled. I keep holy water in my apartment and salt lines at the doors and every religious symbol from every tradition I can research. I don't know if any of it works. I just know that something tried to make me kill myself. And I survived. And now I'm marked. The revival tent is still traveling, Cross still casting out demons night after night. And I get emails from people who were there asking if I saw what they saw, if it was real, if they're crazy, or if the world is different than they thought. I tell them the truth. It was real. It's all real. And now that we've seen it, it won't stop seeing us. The crossroads exists. The devil keeps office hours. And I'm writing this 3 hours before my contract comes due. My name is Nathaniel. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a blues guitarist who made the worst decision of my life 6 months ago when I found the juke joint that isn't supposed to exist anymore. The one where Robert Johnson sold his soul in 1936. The one where musicians still come when they're desperate enough to trade eternity for greatness. I thought it was a legend, a metaphor for hard work and dedication that people romanticized into supernatural myth. I was wrong. The crossroads is real. The deal is literal. And in 3 hours, I'll find out if the song I wrote is good enough to cheat the devil, or if my soul belongs to something that's been collecting them for longer than America has existed. I'd been playing guitar for 15 years, since I was 14. And I was good, but not great. That's the worst place to be as a musician. Skilled enough to know what greatness sounds like, but not talented enough to achieve it yourself. I'd moved to Clarksdale, Mississippi, because that's where the blues was born, where the legends had walked, where maybe some of that magic would rub off on me. I played every dive bar and street corner in the Delta, worked construction during the day, and practiced until my fingers bled at night, and stayed exactly as mediocre as I'd always been. Other musicians had something I didn't, some spark or soul or connection to the music that I could hear but couldn't replicate. I was technical but not transcendent, and that difference was killing me slowly. The other musicians talked about the juke joint in whispers, late at night after too many drinks, the way people talk about things they half believe. They said there was a place at the crossroads of Highway 61 and Highway 49. A building that appeared only at certain times for certain people, where you could make a deal if you were desperate enough. Most dismissed it as folklore, the Robert Johnson legend twisted and retold until it became local mythology. But a few musicians, the ones who'd suddenly gotten exponentially better overnight, would get quiet when it was mentioned, would change the subject or leave the conversation. I noticed those reactions, cataloged them, and started wondering if there was truth under the myth. I found it on a Friday night in March, driving home from a particularly humiliating gig where I'd been booed off stage. I wasn't drunk, wasn't high, wasn't sleep-deprived. I was stone sober and miserable when I reached the intersection and saw the building that shouldn't be there. A small wooden structure with a neon sign that read "Blue Light Juke Joint" in letters that flickered like a dying heartbeat, sitting in a lot that was empty every other time I'd driven past. Music poured from inside. Real blues played by someone who understood the form on a molecular level. I parked and walked in without hesitation, without fear, because at that point I had nothing left to lose except a mediocre career I was already losing. Inside was larger than the building's exterior suggested, stretching back into darkness that seemed to extend further than physically possible. The bar was crowded with people dressed in clothing from different eras, 1930s suits next to 1970s bell-bottoms next to modern streetwear, all drinking and talking and listening to the music. The stage held a single performer, an old black man playing slide guitar with technique so perfect it made me want to weep and quit music forever. When his set ended, he looked directly at me and nodded toward the back, where a door I hadn't noticed stood slightly ajar with light spilling through. The man behind the desk in the back room was not what I expected. Not a devil with horns and a pitchfork, not a demon in a suit. Just a person who could have been any age and any race. Features that shifted subtly every time I tried to focus on them. He said he knew why I was there, that everyone who found the juke joint wanted the same thing, to be great instead of good, to have their name remembered, to play music that moved people's souls. He said he could give me that for a price, and the price was standard. 6 months of greatness in exchange for eternity afterward. I'd play like the legends, create music that would outlive me, and have the career I'd always dreamed about. Then at midnight, on the 6-month anniversary, I'd come back to the juke joint and we'd settle accounts. I should have asked more questions, I should have clarified what eternity afterward meant, or negotiated terms, or walked away. But he pulled out a guitar, a battered acoustic that looked like it had been played by 100 different hands, and said I should try it first, see what I was buying. The moment my fingers touched the strings, I understood what I'd been missing my entire life. The music flowed through me instead of from me, like I was a channel for something larger and older and more true than individual talent. I played for what felt like hours, lost in the sound, and when I finally stopped, every person in that juke joint was silent and staring. The man smiled and said that was just a preview, a sample of what I could have permanently. All I needed to do was sign the book, an ancient ledger filled with names and dates going back centuries. I saw Robert Johnson's signature from 1936, Bessie Smith from 1923, names I recognized from blues history and names I'd never heard of. I signed with a pen that drew blood instead of ink, and the moment my name hit the page, I felt something fundamental change inside me. The guitar suddenly made perfect sense, every note and chord and progression obvious and inevitable. I'd sold something essential to gain everything I wanted. The 6 months that followed were exactly what he'd promised. I played with skill that defied explanation, wrote songs that made people cry, got offers from record labels and booking agents and producers. My music was transcendent, the kind of blues that reached into your chest and squeezed your heart. I was finally great. Finally, the musician I'd always known I could be. And every night I dreamed about the juke joint, about the ledger with my name bleeding into the page, about the man who smiled when I signed and said he'd see me in 6 months. I tried to find loopholes, researched the Robert Johnson legend obsessively, talked to the few musicians I could identify who'd made similar deals. Most wouldn't discuss it, got terrified when I brought it up, said I should honor the contract and accept what came. But one old man, a harmonica player, whose name you'd recognize if I said it, told me there was one way out. The devil loved music more than souls, he said, and if you could write a song so perfect it moved even him, so true it contained genuine holiness, you might be able to trade the song for your freedom. It had only worked once in recorded history, and that musician had died 3 days after his release, his heart giving out from the strain of creating something that perfect. But it was a chance, the only chance, and I had to try. I spent the last month writing that song, pouring everything I had into it. Every lesson I'd learned, every emotion I'd ever felt, every truth about suffering and hope and the human condition. I studied gospel and hymns and sacred music from every tradition, trying to understand what made music holy instead of just beautiful. I wrote and rewrote and refined until my fingers were destroyed and my mind was broken, and I had something that might, possibly, be good enough. Tonight is the 6-month anniversary. Midnight is in 3 hours, and I'm sitting in my apartment with my guitar and the song that's either my salvation or my last performance. I can feel the juke joint calling me, pulling me toward the crossroads like a fish on a line. I'll go because I have to. Because the contract is binding and breaking, it would be worse than honoring it. I'll play my song for the man behind the desk and hope that it's transcendent enough to buy my freedom. And if it's not, if I'm not good enough even with 6 months of borrowed greatness, then I'll join the names in that ledger and spend eternity doing whatever it is he does with the souls he collects. I'm writing this down in case I don't come back, in case the song fails and I disappear into whatever deals with the devil actually mean. If you're a musician and you're struggling, and you hear about a juke joint at the crossroads that can make you great, don't go. The price is real, the contract is binding, and greatness isn't worth eternity. But if you're reading this and I'm still alive, If you hear about a blues guitarist named Nathaniel who played one perfect song and walked away from the crossroads, then you'll know it's possible. You'll know the devil can be beaten with nothing but 6 strings and the truth. It's time to go. The crossroads is calling, and the devil is waiting. And I've got a song that's either salvation or obituary. Wish me luck, horror family. If you never hear from me again, at least I went down playing the blues. If this story chilled you to the bone, if you felt the weight of these southern horrors settle into your soul, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button and join the Verified Fears family, because we're just getting started. There are more stories lurking in the shadows, more nightmares waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me which story haunted you the most. Give this video a like if the South's darkness got under your skin. And remember, some places hold on to their secrets, and some secrets hold on to you. Until next time, horror family, stay afraid.